In 1590, an entire English colony disappeared. No battle. No bodies. No clear explanation. More than 100 men, women, and children had settled on Roanoke Island, hoping to build a new life in the strange and dangerous world of North America. But when an English ship finally returned to the colony, something was terribly wrong. The settlement was empty. The houses were still there, the belongings had been left behind, but every single person was gone. There was only one strange clue. The word CROATOAN had been carved into a wooden post. What happened to the missing colonists? Were they attacked? Did they leave willingly? Did they join another community? Or did something happen that history has never been able to explain? For more than 4 centuries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke has remained one of the greatest mysteries in American history. And tonight, we're going back to the beginning, to the moment when the colony was still alive, its people still hopeful, and nobody knew that they were about to become a mystery that would survive for centuries. Before we begin, if you enjoy mysterious historical stories like this, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Sleep Lore, and share it with someone who loves history and unsolved mysteries. Now turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's return to Roanoke. In the summer of 1587, a small group of English settlers sailed across the Atlantic toward a place that was still largely unknown to them. They were not soldiers marching into battle, nor explorers searching for gold alone. They were families, craftsmen, farmers, and ordinary people who had agreed to leave England behind and attempt something few Europeans had ever done before. They were going to establish a permanent English settlement in the New World. Their destination was Roanoke Island, a narrow piece of land surrounded by the waters of what is now North Carolina. For some of them, the journey had already taken months. The Atlantic had tested the small fleet with rough seas, uncertainty, and long periods of isolation. Every day brought the same horizon, the same endless water, and the growing realization that the life they had known in England was becoming more distant with every passing mile. Among the settlers was a man named John White. White was not simply another colonist. He had been involved in England's earlier attempts to establish a settlement in the region, and this time he had been appointed governor of the new colony. But he was traveling with something more important than a title. His daughter Eleanor was part of the expedition. And she was not alone. Her husband Ananias Dare had also joined the settlement. As the ships approached the coast, the settlers finally saw land. After weeks at sea, the sight must have seemed almost unreal. Beyond the beaches were forests stretching farther than many of them had ever seen. Tall trees covered the landscape, and unfamiliar plants grew in the warm summer air. Birds moved through the branches. The waters around the island were rich with life. For a moment, the place may have looked like the beginning of a new world. But Roanoke was not empty. Native communities had lived throughout the region for generations. They knew the forests, rivers, animals, and seasons far better than the newly arrived English settlers ever could. The English were entering a world they did not understand. Their survival would depend partly on how well they could adapt to it. And perhaps more importantly, on whether they could live peacefully with the people who were already there. The settlers began constructing their homes. They cleared areas of land. They gathered supplies. They tried to create something that could last. For Governor John White, this settlement represented more than a personal adventure. England wanted a permanent foothold in North America. A successful colony could become the beginning of a much larger English presence across the Atlantic. But the settlers faced an immediate problem. They had not brought enough food to remain independent for very long. They needed crops. They needed reliable sources of fresh water. They needed cooperation with local communities. And they needed time. Time was something the settlers could not afford to waste. The previous English settlement at Roanoke had already experienced serious difficulties. Supplies had been limited, relations with some native groups had deteriorated, and the colonists had struggled to survive. This new group hoped to do better. Among them were families who had brought their hopes for a completely new life. They imagined houses surrounded by gardens. They imagined children growing up in a new English community. They imagined a future where they would no longer depend entirely on ships arriving from across the ocean. One of those children would become important to the story that followed. Her name was Virginia Dare. She was born on Roanoke Island in August 1587. Virginia was the daughter of Ananias Dare and Eleanor White Dare. Her birth was significant because she became the first English child born in the territory that would eventually become the United States. For the settlers, her arrival should have been a moment of hope. A child born in the colony suggested that this was no longer simply an expedition. They were beginning to build a community. But behind that moment of celebration was a growing problem. The colony was isolated. England was thousands of miles away. The Atlantic Ocean stood between Roanoke and the supplies they needed. And winter was approaching. Governor John White understood what that meant. If the colony was going to survive, they needed more food and supplies. So White made a difficult decision. He would return to England. His plan was simple. He would sail back across the Atlantic, explain the colony's situation, gather additional supplies, and return to Roanoke as quickly as possible. The settlers would remain behind. They would continue building the colony while he was gone. Nobody expected the separation to last long. Nobody believed that several years might pass before White saw them again. And nobody could have imagined that when he finally returned, the settlement he had left behind would be completely empty. For now, however, there was no reason to believe that anything terrible was about to happen. The colony was still alive. Children were being born. Homes were being built. The settlers were trying to create a future. And somewhere beyond the horizon, across the vast Atlantic Ocean, John White was preparing to leave them. He believed he would be back soon. He had no way of knowing that the next time he saw Roanoke, he would not find the people he had left behind. John White watched the shoreline of Roanoke disappear behind him. The island slowly became smaller until the trees were nothing more than a dark line against the horizon. Behind him remained the people he loved. His daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias Dare, his newborn granddaughter Virginia, and more than 100 other settlers who were depending on him to return with supplies. White had every reason to believe that the separation would be temporary. The journey back to England would be difficult, but it was necessary. Without additional food, tools, weapons, and other supplies, the colony could not survive for long. So the ship continued eastward. Day after day, the Atlantic stretched endlessly around them. The settlers who remained on Roanoke had no way of knowing exactly when White would return. They could only wait. And waiting in an isolated colony was not easy. The settlement still needed to produce enough food for everyone. The surrounding forests were unfamiliar. The weather could change quickly, and relations with neighboring native communities were complicated. Some interactions had been peaceful. Others had been marked by suspicion and violence. The English settlers were still strangers in a land they barely understood. Meanwhile, White's ship continued toward England. After weeks at sea, the familiar coastline finally appeared. White had returned. But he did not return as a wealthy explorer carrying news of an easy victory. He returned with a problem. The colony needed help. More ships were required. More supplies were required. And most importantly, White needed to return to Roanoke. He expected that England would support the settlement. But history had other plans. England was preparing for war. The political situation had changed dramatically. Spain was becoming an increasingly dangerous enemy, and English attention was turning toward the threat of the Spanish Armada. Ships were needed. Sailors were needed. Money was needed. The English government had more immediate concerns than sending a rescue fleet across the Atlantic. White's plans were suddenly trapped between the needs of his colony and the needs of England. He could not simply hire a large ship and sail back whenever he wished. Ships were being prepared for war. Experienced sailors were being recruited. Resources were being redirected. The colony at Roanoke had become a distant concern. Still, White did not give up. He searched for a way to return. He managed to arrange another expedition, but circumstances continued to work against him. The Atlantic was dangerous. The ships available to him were not always suitable for carrying large amounts of supplies. And the growing conflict with Spain made every voyage more complicated. The settlers at Roanoke were waiting. But White could not tell them why he was delayed. There was no quick communication across the Atlantic. No message could travel between England and North Carolina in a matter of hours. There was only the ocean. Weeks became months, and eventually more than a year passed. The people on Roanoke had been expecting White to return. Instead, they were left alone. Among them was Eleanor Dare, caring for her young daughter. Virginia Dare was still a baby. The colony had to continue without its governor. Every day, the settlers faced the same basic questions. What would they eat? Where would they find enough fresh water? How would they protect themselves? What would happen if their crops failed? And what would they do if relations with neighboring communities became hostile? The colony was no longer simply waiting for supplies. It was becoming a community forced to survive on its own. The settlers had entered the New World believing that England would remain connected to them. But the distance between Roanoke and England was becoming more than a geographical distance. It was becoming a dangerous isolation. Back in England, John White continued trying to organize another voyage. He desperately wanted to return to his family. He wanted to see his daughter. He wanted to hold the granddaughter he had seen only once. Most of all, he wanted to know that the colony was safe. Eventually, an opportunity appeared. A voyage to the New World was being prepared. White would finally have a chance to return. The journey began. But this time, the ships were not simply carrying colonists and supplies. They were operating in a world where England and Spain were moving toward open war. The Atlantic had become dangerous. Enemy ships were searching for English vessels. Every voyage carried risk. And before White could reach Roanoke, the expedition encountered another problem. The ships needed to return to England. The voyage was disrupted. The settlers would have to wait even longer. For White, the delay must have been unbearable. He knew exactly where his family was. He knew they were separated from him by thousands of miles. And he had no way of knowing what was happening to them. Eventually, however, another opportunity came. In 1590, White finally sailed toward Roanoke again. 3 years had passed since he had left. 3 years. In that time, his granddaughter had grown from a newborn into a small child. His daughter had lived through seasons without him. The colony had endured an entire period of isolation. And White had no idea what he was about to find. As the ship approached the coast of North Carolina, White began looking for the familiar landmarks. He remembered Roanoke. He remembered the settlement. He remembered the people. He expected to see smoke rising from cooking fires. He expected to hear voices. He expected someone to come toward the shore. But as the ship moved closer, something felt wrong. The island appeared strangely quiet. There was no obvious sign of the settlers. No welcoming party. No familiar movement. No sound of a busy settlement. White and the others searched the shoreline. They looked for evidence that the colonists were nearby. Then they finally reached the place where the settlement had stood. And what they saw would become one of the greatest mysteries in American history. The houses were gone. The people were gone. The colony was empty. White had crossed the Atlantic to find his family. Instead, he had found silence. White had finally reached Roanoke. After 3 years of uncertainty, delays, and a dangerous journey across the Atlantic, he was standing on the island where he had left his family. But there was no one waiting for him. The settlement was silent. At first, White and the others searched the area carefully. Perhaps the colonists had simply moved farther inland. Perhaps they had abandoned the original settlement and established themselves somewhere else. There had to be an explanation. The first clues seemed almost reassuring. The buildings had not been destroyed. There were no obvious signs of a battle. No bodies were discovered. No large amount of blood suggested that the settlement had been attacked. It was as if the people had simply gathered their belongings and left. But where had they gone? White began searching the settlement for anything that might explain their disappearance. Then he noticed something carved into a tree. The letters were simple but unmistakable. CROATOAN. White already knew the word. CROATOAN was the name of an island located to the south of Roanoke, and it was also associated with a native community in the region. This was important. Before leaving the colony years earlier, White had given the settlers instructions. If they were forced to leave Roanoke, they were supposed to carve the name of the place where they intended to go. And if they were in danger, they were supposed to mark the sign with a cross. There was no cross beside the word. That detail changed everything. Perhaps the colonists had not vanished mysteriously at all. Perhaps they had moved. Perhaps they had gone to CROATOAN. For White, this possibility must have brought a moment of hope. His daughter could still be alive. His granddaughter could still be alive. The other settlers could still be alive. They might have simply left Roanoke and traveled south. White decided that the next step was obvious. He would search for them. The expedition prepared to continue along the coast. But the weather was beginning to change. The sea was becoming increasingly dangerous. Storms were approaching. The ships could not remain in the area indefinitely. White wanted to search CROATOAN immediately, but circumstances were turning against him once again. The weather worsened. The voyage became dangerous. And before White could properly investigate the island, the expedition was forced to abandon the search. It was one of the cruelest moments of his life. He had crossed an ocean to find his family. He had finally discovered a clue suggesting that they might still be alive. And now he had to leave without knowing the truth. The ships turned away from the coast. Roanoke disappeared behind them once again. But this time White carried something with him. A question. What had happened to the people who once lived there? The word CROATOAN offered one possible answer. But it did not explain everything. Why had the colonists left? Had they moved peacefully? Had they joined a native community? Had disease or hunger forced them away? Had they been attacked? Or had something happened during those 3 years that White could never discover? There was another possibility. Perhaps the colonists had split into smaller groups. Perhaps some had traveled inland. Others may have moved south toward CROATOAN. If that had happened, the search for them would become almost impossible. More than 100 people could disappear into a vast landscape without leaving much evidence behind. And that landscape was enormous. The forest stretched for miles. Rivers and marshes divided the region. Native communities were spread across a territory the English barely understood. A small group of Europeans could disappear into such a world surprisingly easily. For White, however, the mystery was deeply personal. The missing settlers were not merely names on a list. His daughter was among them. His granddaughter had been born while he was there. He had seen Virginia Dare as an infant. Now he did not even know whether she had survived. He would never see her again. John White returned to England carrying the uncertainty with him. The Roanoke colonists had become missing people. But there was no definitive evidence that they had died. No graves were found. No battlefield was discovered. No written explanation was left behind. Only a deserted settlement. And a single word carved into wood. CROATOAN. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and curious investigators would return to that clue. Some would argue that it was the answer. Others would argue that it was only the beginning. Because if the colonists really had gone to CROATOAN, another question remained. What happened to them after they arrived? And that question would lead investigators far beyond the abandoned houses of Roanoke. The ships carrying John White were already leaving the coast when the full weight of what had happened began to settle in. He had found the clue. He had found the word CROATOAN. But he had not found his family. For White, that distinction was everything. If the colonists had truly gone to CROATOAN, then there was still a chance that Eleanor, Ananias, Virginia Dare, and the others were alive. The problem was that White had almost no time left. The weather was worsening, and the ships needed to leave the dangerous waters. He wanted to return to the settlement and continue the search, but the Atlantic was not willing to wait for him. The expedition eventually sailed back toward England. And with that departure, the mystery of Roanoke entered a new stage. The people were gone. But they had not necessarily vanished. They may have simply moved beyond the place where White expected to find them. The island of CROATOAN became the most important destination in the mystery. CROATOAN was associated with a native community that had maintained contact with earlier English expeditions. The English settlers knew the name. They knew the location. And most importantly, they had left behind a clue pointing toward it. But a single word carved into wood could not tell White what had happened during the 3 years he had been away. The colonists might have traveled there voluntarily. They might have been welcomed. They might have traded with local communities and gradually adopted a different way of life. Or something far more complicated might have happened. The settlers had arrived with European customs, European tools, European clothing, and European expectations. But surviving in the coastal wilderness required adaptation. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed protection. And they needed relationships with people who already understood the land. The longer the colonists remained isolated, the more dependent they may have become on those around them. That possibility would later become one of the most important theories about their disappearance. Perhaps there had never been one dramatic moment when the colony vanished. Perhaps there had been a slow transformation. The English settlers may have divided into smaller groups. Some could have moved toward CROATOAN. Others may have traveled inland. Over time, their English identity could have become less visible. They might have married into native communities. Their children could have grown up speaking languages other than English. Their clothing and customs could have changed. And if that happened, the people who had once been called the Lost Colonists may not have thought of themselves as lost at all. They may simply have been living somewhere else. But in England, John White could only see the situation from a distance. He had no reliable report from the colony. No letter had reached him. No survivor had arrived. No ship had brought news. The ocean had separated the two worlds. And the longer the silence continued, the more difficult it became to discover the truth. White himself would eventually grow old. He continued to wonder about his family. He never learned what had happened to Virginia Dare. The child who had been born on Roanoke became one of the most famous figures connected with the mystery, despite the fact that almost nothing certain is known about her life. Her existence is documented. Her disappearance is documented. Everything between those 2 points is uncertain. That uncertainty created a mystery that would survive for centuries. But there was another reason the story refused to disappear. The English did not completely abandon their interest in the region. Later expeditions and settlements would return to North America. As English settlements expanded, people occasionally reported stories that seemed to suggest that descendants of the Roanoke colonists might still exist. There were stories of native people with European features. Stories of unfamiliar customs. Stories of people who supposedly knew English words. None of these accounts provided conclusive proof. But each one added another layer to the mystery. The possibility remained alive. What if the colonists had survived? What if they had become part of another community? What if their descendants were still living somewhere in the region? For historians, these questions became increasingly difficult to separate from legend. Over the centuries, the story of Roanoke grew. The abandoned settlement became a symbol of disappearance. The carved word became famous. And Virginia Dare became a figure surrounded by imagination. But beneath all the legends was a simple historical fact. More than 100 English settlers had established a colony. 3 years later they were gone. And the man who had left them there never discovered their fate. The search for the truth would continue long after John White was gone. Centuries later, researchers would examine maps, archaeological sites, native oral traditions, old documents, and even the landscape itself. They would search for evidence that could connect the missing colonists to another settlement. And gradually, a new possibility began to emerge. Perhaps the answer was not on Roanoke Island at all. Perhaps the colonists had moved west. Perhaps they had traveled inland along rivers and waterways. And if that was true, the mystery was much larger than anyone had imagined. The empty houses on Roanoke were not the end of the story. They were only the place where the trail disappeared. And somewhere beyond that trail, the fate of the lost colony was still waiting to be uncovered. The empty settlement on Roanoke had given historians one important clue, but it had also created a much larger question. If the colonists had left the island, where had they gone? The answer might have been hidden somewhere beyond the coastline. To understand that possibility, it was necessary to look at the world surrounding Roanoke. The English settlers had arrived in a landscape that was completely different from the England they knew. Dense forests covered enormous areas. Rivers crossed the land in every direction. Marshes and wetlands made travel difficult. Native communities lived across the region, connected by trade, family relationships, alliances, and centuries of knowledge about the land. For someone unfamiliar with the area, traveling even a relatively short distance could be difficult. For more than 100 people, moving an entire settlement would have been an enormous undertaking. But it was not impossible. The colonists had boats. They had tools. They had weapons. And they had already learned that survival depended on cooperation. If food became scarce on Roanoke, moving to a place with better resources may have been the most practical decision available to them. The clue left behind suggested that at least some of them may have intended to move toward CROATOAN. But CROATOAN may not have been their final destination. It could have been a temporary location, a meeting place, or simply a direction. This distinction became important. The word carved into the tree did not say what had happened to the colonists after they left. It only pointed toward somewhere else. And that left investigators with an enormous territory to search. There was another problem. Time. The colony disappeared sometime before White returned in 1590. Then decades passed. Then centuries. Wooden buildings disappeared. Natural landscapes changed. Trees grew over old paths. Rivers shifted. Coastlines changed. Anything the colonists had left behind could have been buried, destroyed, or absorbed into the environment. Even if the settlers had survived, their traces could have become almost impossible to recognize. A small European object might survive underground. A piece of pottery. A metal tool. A fragment of glass. A coin. Something ordinary to the colonists could become extraordinary evidence centuries later. But archaeologists would need to know where to look. And that was the hardest part. There were simply too many possibilities. Perhaps the settlers traveled south. Perhaps they went inland. Perhaps different groups moved in different directions. Perhaps some remained near the coast, while others disappeared into the forests. The colony might have fragmented slowly, rather than disappearing all at once. Imagine the situation. A group of settlers is waiting for supplies. The ships do not arrive. Food becomes harder to obtain. The seasons change. Children grow older. The adults begin to realize that help may not come soon. At some point, remaining in one place may no longer seem safe. A decision would have to be made. Stay. Or leave. If they chose to leave, they would have needed to carry whatever they could. Tools. Weapons. Clothing. Food. Perhaps seeds. Perhaps personal possessions. Anything too heavy or unnecessary would have been abandoned. That could explain why White found the settlement without obvious signs of destruction. The colonists may have simply taken what they could and walked away. But where would they go? The surrounding native communities would have been crucial. The English could not survive indefinitely without local knowledge. Native people knew which plants were safe to eat. They knew where water could be found. They understood the seasons. They knew the rivers and paths. They knew how to move through the forests. For the colonists, cooperation could mean survival. And cooperation could eventually lead to something more profound. Integration. A person who entered another community might gradually adopt its language, customs, clothing, and way of life. A marriage could connect families. Children could grow up between cultures. Within a generation, the original European identity of a small group could become difficult to distinguish. This possibility offers a very different interpretation of the Roanoke mystery. Perhaps the colonists did not disappear. Perhaps they survived by becoming part of the world around them. But if that happened, why was there no clear record? The answer may lie partly in the nature of the evidence. European historians recorded what they considered important. Native communities preserved their histories in different ways. Much of that knowledge was passed through oral traditions. And when European expansion transformed the region, many communities themselves faced displacement, warfare, and disease. Records were lost. Stories changed. Connections became harder to trace. The result was a historical puzzle with pieces scattered across different cultures. Still, some clues began to attract attention. Later English settlers heard stories about native people who supposedly had European ancestry. Some accounts describe people who appeared unusually light-skinned. Others mentioned strange words or customs. But these reports were written years after the Roanoke colony disappeared. They were often based on second-hand information. And none could prove that the people being described were descendants of the Lost Colony. The evidence was intriguing. But intriguing was not the same as conclusive. For centuries, the mystery remained suspended between possibility and proof. The colonists could have died. They could have been attacked. They could have integrated into native communities. They could have divided into several groups. Or several of these things could have happened at the same time. The truth may not have been one simple event. And perhaps that is why Roanoke remains so difficult to solve. The mystery may not be about where the colonists went. It may be about what happened to them after they left. Because somewhere beyond the abandoned settlement, more than 100 lives continued, or ended, in a world that left behind remarkably little evidence. And eventually, investigators would begin looking not only at the coastline and the forests, but beneath the ground itself. For centuries, the search for the lost colony depended mainly on written accounts, old maps, and stories passed down through generations. But eventually, investigators began asking a different question. What if the answer was still buried beneath the ground? Roanoke Island had changed dramatically since the colonists lived there. Forests had grown. Land had shifted. Weather had altered the coastline. And centuries of human activity had covered whatever the settlers might have left behind. If the colonists had lived there for several years, they must have left objects behind. The problem was finding them. Archaeologists began examining the region carefully. They searched for traces of buildings. They looked for tools, pottery, glass, nails, weapons, and other objects that could connect the site to the missing settlers. Every small discovery had the potential to change the story. A single European artifact found in the right location could provide evidence that the colonists had moved farther than previously believed. But archaeology is rarely that simple. An object found in the soil does not always tell you who left it there. European objects had been traded throughout the region. Later settlers had also traveled across the same landscape. An artifact could belong to the Roanoke colonists or to someone who arrived many years later. The search therefore required more than finding old objects. Researchers needed context. Where was an object found? How deep was it buried? What other objects were nearby? Could the material be dated? Could it be connected specifically to the period when the lost colony existed? These questions became essential. One of the most interesting possibilities was that the colonists had moved away from the original settlement. If so, researchers needed to search beyond Roanoke itself. The surrounding region became increasingly important. Historical maps offered possible clues. Old accounts described native settlements, rivers, paths, and coastal locations. By comparing these records with modern geography, researchers could identify places where the colonists might have traveled. But there was a major obstacle. The landscape described by 16th-century explorers was not identical to the landscape of later centuries. Coastlines changed. Islands shifted. Marshes expanded and disappeared. Rivers altered their courses. Some locations mentioned in old documents became difficult to identify. The physical world itself had become part of the mystery. Still, researchers continued. One of the most important areas of interest was the region associated with CROATOAN. If the colonists had followed their own message, this was one of the first places where evidence might be found. Archaeological investigations eventually uncovered objects associated with European settlement in areas connected with native communities. Fragments of pottery, metal objects, glass, other materials that suggested contact between Europeans and native populations. These discoveries were important, but again, they did not provide a final answer. European goods had entered native trade networks for decades. A European object did not automatically mean a lost colonist had been there. The mystery remained. Then another possibility became increasingly interesting. What if the colonists had traveled farther inland? The region contained waterways that could serve as natural routes. Boats could carry people and supplies much more efficiently than walking through dense forests. A group trying to relocate might have followed rivers toward communities where food and shelter were more available. If they moved inland, Roanoke Island would have become only the beginning of their journey. And the farther they traveled, the harder it would become for modern investigators to find them. There was also the possibility that not everyone left together. Perhaps a smaller group remained behind. Perhaps another group traveled south. Another may have moved inland. If the colony fractured in this way, the word CROATOAN might have referred only to one group. The others could have gone somewhere else entirely. This would explain why later searches repeatedly failed to locate one single settlement containing clear evidence of all the colonists. The mystery could have been scattered across an entire region. For archaeologists, this created a difficult problem. They were not looking for one lost village. They might have been looking for traces of several small communities spread across hundreds of miles. And there was another possibility that made the search even harder. The colonists may have stopped living as a separate English community. If they integrated with native groups, their homes would no longer have looked distinctly English. Their tools might have been mixed with local objects. Their children might have grown up with different customs. Their original settlement identity could have disappeared within a generation. In that case, archaeology might find evidence of European contact without ever being able to prove exactly who those Europeans were. The distinction between evidence and proof became the central problem. Researchers could find clues. They could build theories. They could compare historical accounts. But the final connection remained missing. And yet one discovery continued to attract attention. A small object. Something that seemed ordinary at first. But its possible connection to the lost colony would eventually make it one of the most discussed archaeological clues in the entire Roanoke mystery. It was found far from the original settlement. And if it truly belonged to the colonists, it could suggest that at least some of them had traveled deep into the interior. The search was beginning to move away from the empty houses of Roanoke, and toward a place where the colonists may have disappeared into another community altogether. The search for the missing colonists was beginning to move away from Roanoke Island. If the settlers had survived, they could have traveled along the rivers and waterways that connected the coastal communities. One of the regions that attracted attention was the area inhabited by the Roanoke people. The Roanoke were one of the native communities living in the region when the English arrived. They had their own settlements, political relationships, traditions, and trading networks. For the English colonists, such communities could have represented something essential. A chance to survive. The colonists had arrived expecting to build an English settlement. But after years without reliable support from England, that original plan may have become impossible. Food was limited. Supplies were uncertain. And the surrounding environment was unfamiliar. Joining or cooperating with an established native community could have offered the settlers a much better chance of survival. But this possibility raises an important question. Would the colonists have been accepted? The answer was not simple. Relations between Europeans and native communities varied from place to place and changed over time. Some encounters involved trade and cooperation. Others involved violence, mistrust, and competition for land. The Roanoke settlers had already experienced both sides of this relationship. So if they moved away from the island, their survival may have depended on which communities they encountered and how those communities responded. There was another reason researchers became interested in inland settlements. European objects had begun appearing in places far from the original Roanoke colony. Metal tools, glass beads, fragments of European-made pottery. Small objects that could have traveled through trade networks. At first, these discoveries seemed promising. But they also created another problem. Trade between native communities and Europeans was already widespread. A European object could travel hundreds of miles without the original owner ever traveling with it. A knife could be traded. A piece of copper could be exchanged. A glass bead could pass from one community to another. So finding European material did not automatically mean finding the lost colonists. Still, researchers continued following the trail. They compared archaeological evidence with historical records. They examined where European goods appeared. They looked for places where a group of English settlers might realistically have traveled. And gradually, a picture began to emerge. The colonists may not have disappeared into an empty wilderness. They may have entered a complex network of native communities. If so, the story of Roanoke was not necessarily about a group of people being destroyed. It could have been about a group of people being absorbed. That possibility changes the meaning of the word lost. From the English perspective, the colonists were lost because England could no longer find them. But from the perspective of the people who may have welcomed them, they might not have been lost at all. They may have become neighbors, friends, family, or members of a new community. Imagine a young English child growing up in such a place. She might remember little of Roanoke. She might learn the language of the people around her. She might grow up knowing the forests and rivers better than any English settlement. Her parents might still remember England. But for her, this new land would be home. That possibility is especially interesting when we think about Virginia Dare. She was born on Roanoke. If she survived, she would have spent most of her childhood in North America. Her identity could have changed completely depending on where she grew up. But there is no reliable record telling us what happened to her. No confirmed grave. No confirmed letter. No confirmed portrait from later life. Only a birth record and a mystery. And that mystery became increasingly connected with stories about people of mixed European and native ancestry. Over the centuries, various accounts claimed that native communities in the region remembered people who had come from the English settlement. Some stories even described people who were said to have unusual physical features or knowledge of English. But historians must be careful with such accounts. Many were recorded long after the events. Some were based on rumors. Others were interpreted through the assumptions of European observers. And oral traditions can change as they are passed from one generation to another. So these stories cannot, by themselves, prove that the Roanoke colonists survived. Yet they keep the possibility alive. The most fascinating part of the mystery is that several explanations can exist at the same time. Some colonists may have died from disease or starvation. Some may have been killed during conflicts. Others may have joined native communities. And some may have moved to entirely different settlements. There is no rule saying that every member of the colony had to share the same fate. More than 100 people were involved. They had different ages, different skills, different relationships, different reasons for remaining in the new world. Their paths could have separated. And if they did, then the disappearance of Roanoke was not one event. It was a chain of smaller events that gradually erased the colony as a recognizable English settlement. But there was still one question that researchers could not answer. If the colonists had integrated into other communities, why had they left so little unmistakable evidence behind? Where were the unmistakable English objects? Where were their written records? Where were the buildings? Where were the graves? And why had no surviving colonist ever returned to England? The answers might have been hidden in the landscape. But they might also have been hidden in the memories of the people who lived there. And eventually, historians would begin paying closer attention to something that had often been overlooked. The native accounts of the region. Because the people who may have known what happened to the colonists were not necessarily the English. They were the people who had already been living there. Long before the English arrived at Roanoke, the region was already home to many native communities. They knew the rivers. They knew the forests. They knew which lands flooded during certain seasons and which paths remained passable. For generations, their lives had been connected to the landscape in ways the English settlers could not yet understand. This was the world into which the Roanoke colonists had entered. And if the settlers had survived after leaving the island, the native communities may have played a central role in their fate. The English often viewed the New World through the idea of establishing their own settlements. But survival required something more practical. Food, shelter, knowledge, protection. The colonists could build houses, but they could not immediately understand every plant, river, or season. The people who already lived there possessed that knowledge. Early encounters between the English and native communities therefore became extremely important. Some involved trade. The English exchanged European goods for food and other necessities. Metal objects, tools, and manufactured items could be valuable to native communities. The English, in return, needed resources that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. But cooperation did not always last. Misunderstandings could become conflicts. A shortage of food could create suspicion. Competition for resources could turn former partners into enemies. And disease brought by Europeans created another enormous problem. Native populations across the Americas suffered devastating losses from diseases to which they had little previous exposure. The consequences were sometimes catastrophic. Entire communities could be weakened or displaced. So when thinking about the fate of the Roanoke settlers, it is important to remember that they were not living in an unchanged world. The region itself was going through enormous disruption. European arrival was changing trade networks, political relationships, and population patterns. The colonists were only one part of that much larger transformation. If the settlers moved away from Roanoke, they would have entered this complicated world. They might have been accepted by one community and rejected by another. They might have exchanged goods for food. They might have married into local families. They might have traveled from one settlement to another. And eventually, their original identity could have become difficult to separate from the communities around them. This possibility may explain why later English observers sometimes heard stories that seemed to point toward surviving colonists. But those stories were never clear enough. A traveler might hear that people with unusual ancestry lived somewhere inland. Another person might report that a native community had knowledge of English words. Someone else might claim that an old story described strangers who had arrived generations earlier. Each account seemed interesting, but none could provide a complete answer. The problem became even more complicated as more Europeans arrived in North America. New settlements were established. Trade expanded. Conflicts increased. Native communities moved or were displaced. People from different backgrounds became connected through marriage and commerce. With every passing generation, the original events of Roanoke became harder to identify. Still, some historians wondered whether the colonists might have left linguistic traces. If English settlers had joined another community, perhaps a few English words survived. Perhaps names were passed down. Perhaps certain objects or customs remained. But language can change quickly. A child raised in another community may learn a different language as their first language. After several generations, only a handful of foreign words might remain. And those words could be impossible to connect confidently to the Roanoke settlers. There was also the possibility that the colonists themselves changed languages. If they married into native communities, their children might grow up speaking local languages. English could become a secondary language or disappear completely. That would make the colony almost invisible. The English had expected to create a permanent settlement that looked unmistakably English. Instead, if the colonists survived through integration, they could have become part of another society. Their houses would no longer be English houses. Their clothing would no longer be English clothing. Their descendants might not even know that their ancestors had once crossed the Atlantic. This is one of the most haunting possibilities in the entire Roanoke story. The colonists may have disappeared from English history while continuing to exist within another history. But there was one clue that seemed to challenge this idea. The colonists had left behind a written word. CROATOAN. If they had planned to integrate into native communities, why leave the message? Perhaps it was simply a direction. Perhaps they wanted White to know where they had gone. Perhaps they expected him to follow. And perhaps they believed he would return much sooner. Remember, when White left Roanoke, the colonists expected him to come back. They could not have known that war, ships, and political events would keep him away for years. They may have believed that England would return quickly. When no ship appeared, they had to make decisions without knowing when help would come. At some point, they may have realized that waiting was no longer possible. They had to choose survival over remaining together. That may have been the moment when the colony truly disappeared. Not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of choices. A family leaves. Another follows. A group travels south. Another moves inland. Some people remain behind. Some may die. Others survive. And eventually, the settlement that once represented an English colony becomes empty. No single person remains to explain what happened. No written record survives. Only fragments, stories, artifacts, and a word carved into a tree. But as researchers continued searching, another clue began attracting attention. It came from a place much farther inland. And unlike a rumor or a story passed down through generations, this clue was something that could actually be examined. An object, small enough to hold in a hand, old enough to belong to the world of the Lost Colony. And if its connection to Roanoke could be proven, it might finally reveal where at least some of the colonists went. The object had been discovered at a location that few people would have expected. And it would become one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence in the entire mystery. The search for the Lost Colony had continued for centuries without producing a definitive answer. Then, in 1937, a small stone appeared that seemed to promise exactly what historians had been waiting for. It was discovered near Edisto Island in South Carolina by a man named L.E. Hammond. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. It was simply a stone. But carved across its surface were words that appeared to tell a remarkable story. The inscription was supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White and the mother of Virginia Dare. If genuine, it could have changed everything. For the first time, there seemed to be a written account from one of the missing colonists themselves. The stone appeared to describe a journey away from Roanoke. It referred to hardship. It referred to conflict. And most importantly, it seemed to suggest that the colonists had traveled south and experienced terrible events after leaving Roanoke. The discovery immediately attracted attention. Historians examined the stone. Researchers studied the inscription. People began asking whether the mystery that had lasted for more than 3 centuries had finally been solved. Could Eleanor Dare have survived? Could she have left a message explaining what happened to the colony? Could this stone finally tell the world where Virginia Dare and the other settlers had gone? For a brief moment it seemed possible. The stone was taken to Emory University, where experts examined it. But the excitement did not last. Questions began to appear. The language of the inscription was strange. Some of the wording seemed inconsistent with what would be expected from a 16th-century English colonist. The story described on the stone was also difficult to reconcile with known historical evidence. More stones were claimed to exist. The original discovery was presented as the first of a much larger story. But when researchers searched for additional evidence, the situation became increasingly suspicious. The promised stones did not provide the convincing confirmation that supporters had hoped for. Instead, doubts grew. Could the entire discovery be a hoax? The possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. Experts examined the stone more closely. The inscription did not provide the kind of reliable evidence historians needed. Eventually, the Dare stone came to be regarded as a forgery. The dream of finally hearing from Eleanor Dare disappeared. The stone that had seemed to open a door into the Lost Colony instead became another mystery of its own. Who had created it? Why? And how had it managed to attract so much attention? The episode became a warning about the Roanoke mystery. When a story remains unsolved for centuries, people desperately want an answer. And that desire can make extraordinary claims seem convincing. The Dare Stone had offered exactly what everyone wanted. A message from the missing colonists. A direct explanation. A story that connected Eleanor Dare, Virginia Dare, and the journey away from Roanoke. But wanting something to be true does not make it true. The stone could not provide the final answer. And once it was discredited, historians were forced back to the evidence that could actually be tested. The old records. The archaeological remains. The native histories. The landscape. And the few genuine artifacts that could be securely dated to the period of the colony. The failure of the Dare Stone was disappointing. But it also helped researchers understand something important. The Roanoke mystery could not be solved by a dramatic story alone. It would require evidence. And that evidence would have to survive careful examination. The colonists had left behind very little. But very little was not the same as nothing. Their story had left traces across the landscape. Some were written. Some were buried. Some existed in the memories of later generations. And some were hidden in places where nobody had yet thought to look. The question was no longer simply whether the colonists had disappeared. That much was certain. The real question was what happened after they left Roanoke. Did they travel south toward CROATOAN? Did they move inland? Did they divide into several groups? Did they join native communities? Or did different groups experience completely different fates? The Dare Stone had promised an answer and failed. But the search was not over. In fact, the most important discoveries would come from a different direction. Not from a mysterious inscription. Not from a centuries-old story. But from archaeology. Researchers would begin looking at places where the colonists might actually have lived after leaving Roanoke. And one location in particular would attract increasing attention. A place where evidence of European life had been found among a native community. If those artifacts could be connected specifically to the Roanoke settlers, they might finally provide something the Dare Stone never could. Physical evidence. Evidence that could be examined, tested, and questioned. Because after centuries of legends, the Lost Colony needed something far more valuable than another story. It needed proof. After the failure of the Dare Stone, researchers returned to the evidence that could actually be tested. One of the most important places was CROATOAN. The name had been carved into the settlement before the colonists disappeared, and for centuries it remained the strongest clue pointing toward their possible destination. Modern researchers know the area as Hatteras Island, but in the 16th century it was home to the CROATOAN people. Unlike Roanoke, CROATOAN was not simply an abandoned English settlement. It was part of an established native world. People lived there. They traded. They traveled. They maintained relationships with neighboring communities. And European objects had begun entering those networks. When archaeologists examined sites associated with the CROATOAN people, they found objects that showed contact with Europeans. Glass beads. Copper items. Fragments of European-made material. These discoveries were important because they demonstrated that Europeans had reached and interacted with communities in the region. But there was an immediate problem. How could anyone prove that these objects belonged specifically to the Roanoke colonists? European traders and explorers had been visiting the Atlantic coast for years. Objects could move from one community to another through trade. A piece of European metal found at a native settlement did not necessarily mean an English colonist had lived there. The evidence had to be much more specific. Researchers therefore began looking for objects that were not simply European, but objects that could be connected to the particular period and circumstances of the Roanoke settlement. The search became more difficult because the colonists themselves may have changed their way of life. If they had joined the CROATOAN community, they might have stopped using many of the objects they had brought from England. Their European possessions could have been traded, lost, broken, or simply buried. And if the colonists had remained in the region for generations, their descendants might have left almost no obvious trace of their European origins. Yet the archaeological evidence from Hatteras remained intriguing. It suggested that European and native communities were interacting closely. And that made the old word carved at Roanoke more interesting than ever. CROATOAN. Perhaps it really was a message. Perhaps the colonists had expected John White to understand it immediately. Maybe they were telling him, "We went here. Follow us." If so, the absence of a cross beside the word could be significant. White had instructed the settlers to mark a cross if they were forced to leave because of danger. There was no cross. That might suggest they had not been driven away by an immediate emergency. Instead, they may have left according to a plan. Perhaps they moved because they could no longer survive at Roanoke. Perhaps they relocated to a place where food was more abundant. Perhaps they believed White would soon return and find them there. But White did not return soon. 3 years passed. That changed everything. The people who left Roanoke expecting their governor to return may have gradually realized that they had been forgot. The colony could no longer wait. The settlers had to adapt. And adaptation may have meant becoming part of the surrounding native communities. This theory became known as one of the most plausible explanations for the disappearance. But plausible is not the same as proven. There was still no document saying that Eleanor Dare had reached CROATOAN. No surviving letter from Ananias Dare. No confirmed record of Virginia Dare. No inscription left by the settlers explaining what happened after their departure. Only fragments of evidence. And fragments can be interpreted in many ways. Some researchers argued that the CROATOAN theory was the strongest explanation. Others believed the colonists could have traveled inland. Some suggested that several groups may have followed different paths. There were even theories involving violence, disease, starvation, and conflict. The truth could have been a combination of several possibilities. Perhaps some colonists reached CROATOAN. Others may have traveled inland. Some may have died along the way. Others could have survived and integrated into native communities. More than 100 people were involved, after all. Their lives did not have to end in the same place. This realization changed how researchers approached the mystery. Instead of searching for one lost colony, they began looking for multiple traces of a displaced population. The question became broader. Where could small groups of English settlers have gone? Which native communities could have received them? Which rivers and trails could they have followed? And where could archaeological evidence still survive after 4 centuries? These questions led investigators farther inland. Away from the coast. Away from Roanoke. Away from the famous word carved into the tree. And eventually, attention turned toward a region where something unexpected had been discovered. A small collection of European artifacts had been found among the remains of a native settlement. The objects were not enough to solve the mystery, but their location was intriguing. They were far enough from Roanoke to suggest that the colonists could have traveled there. And if they had, then the lost colony might have left the island much earlier than anyone realized. The search was entering unfamiliar territory. And with every mile away from Roanoke, one possibility became harder to ignore. Perhaps the colonists had not vanished at the edge of the known world. Perhaps they had simply disappeared into another community. The farther researchers moved away from Roanoke, the more difficult the mystery became. The coastline had provided one obvious clue. CROATOAN. But the interior of the region offered something else. A vast network of rivers, forests, and native settlements through which a small group of people could travel almost unnoticed. If the colonists had decided to leave Roanoke, they would not necessarily have needed to walk through the wilderness. The rivers could have carried them. Water was one of the most important routes through the region. Boats could transport people, food, and possessions far more efficiently than traveling on foot. And the native communities already knew these waterways. They had been using them for generations. For the English settlers, following those routes may have been the most practical way to reach another settlement. But there was a problem. The colonists had no reason to leave behind a detailed map of their journey. If they moved gradually from one community to another, their trail could disappear almost immediately. A wooden boat would decay. A temporary shelter would collapse. Food containers would break. Metal objects could be traded or reused. Even a European tool could eventually become part of another community's material culture. After 4 centuries, almost nothing might remain that clearly identified its original owner. This is why archaeology became so important. Researchers were no longer searching for a complete settlement. They were searching for small pieces of evidence. A European object in the right place. A fragment dating to the right period. An unusual concentration of foreign material. Anything that might suggest that English settlers had passed through. One location became particularly interesting. It was associated with a native settlement known as Madakwam. European artifacts had been discovered in the area. The objects suggested that contact between native people and Europeans had taken place. But again, the evidence did not provide a simple answer. The presence of European objects did not automatically prove that the Roanoke colonists had lived there. European goods could travel through trade. They could be exchanged between communities. They could move over great distances without the original European owner ever seeing the place where the object was eventually found. So researchers had to ask a much more precise question. Could the objects be connected specifically to the 1580s? If they could, the possibility would become more interesting. The Roanoke Colony existed during a very specific period. The settlers arrived in 1587. By 1590 they were gone. Any artifact strongly connected to that narrow period could potentially tell us something about their movements. But even then, certainty would remain difficult. Historical archaeology rarely provides a single piece of evidence that solves everything. Instead, researchers assemble many small pieces. One object. One document. One map. One native tradition. One unusual settlement pattern. Individually, each clue may mean very little. Together, they can begin to form a picture. And the picture emerging around Roanoke was becoming increasingly complex. The colonists may have moved. They may have traded. They may have joined other communities. They may have traveled along rivers. And some may have disappeared through death while others survived. There was no reason to assume that every colonist followed the same path. This possibility also helps explain why the search for one single lost colony had repeatedly failed. The colony may have stopped existing as a single community. Once that happened, there would be no single location where all the answers could be found. Instead, the evidence would be scattered. A little on the coast. A little inland. Perhaps a few objects in one native settlement. Perhaps stories preserved somewhere else. The English had arrived hopping to create a permanent settlement. But survival may have forced them to abandon that idea. Their future could have become something entirely different. Instead of remaining English colonists, they might have become travelers between communities. Instead of building one permanent town, they might have joined existing settlements. Instead of preserving their European identity, they might have gradually adopted the culture around them. If that happened, the disappearance of Roanoke was not necessarily sudden. It could have been a slow process. A process lasting years. Perhaps decades. And that raises an even more intriguing possibility. The colonists may have left descendants. If Virginia Dare survived, she could have grown up somewhere far from Roanoke. She could have married. She could have had children. Her descendants could have lived for generations without knowing the full story of their ancestry. By the time later Europeans encountered their communities, any connection to the original colony might have been remembered only as an old story. But proving such a connection would be extraordinarily difficult. DNA evidence from the 16th century would be rare. Reliable family records would be even rarer. And without a confirmed descendant, there would be no direct line to test. Still, the possibility has fascinated researchers for generations. Could people living in the region today carry ancestry from the lost colony? It is a question that sounds simple. But answering it requires much more than finding someone who looks European. Physical appearance cannot prove ancestry. Neither can a family story alone. The evidence must be supported by historical records, archaeology, genealogy, or genetic data. And so the mystery remains. Yet one thing was becoming clearer. The Roanoke colonists did not necessarily need to vanish into thin air. They only needed to disappear from the English records. If they entered another society, their lives could continue while their identities slowly faded from the historical record. That may be the most realistic explanation for why so little evidence remains. But there was still another possibility that could not be ignored. Not every colonist may have survived. The settlement had been isolated. Disease was a constant danger. Food shortages could be devastating. Conflict was possible. And the journey away from Roanoke itself could have been dangerous. Perhaps some died. Perhaps others survived. Perhaps the colony's disappearance was the result of many different tragedies unfolding at once. If so, the mystery was not one story. It was dozens of individual stories that history failed to record. And somewhere among those forgotten lives was Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the colony. A child whose entire life after her birth remains unknown. But there was one place where researchers hoped the story of those missing settlers might become clearer. A place connected not just to native communities, but to physical evidence of European presence. And there, archaeologists would uncover clues that would once again force historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about Roanoke. The search was becoming more complicated. The farther investigators looked from Roanoke, the more they realized that the missing colonists might not have remained together. A settlement could disappear, but people could survive. And if those people joined other communities, the English colony might disappear without the people themselves disappearing. This possibility became especially important when researchers examined evidence from native settlements farther inland. European objects had been found in places where English colonists could theoretically have traveled. But there was still a difficult question. Were these objects evidence of the lost colony? Or were they simply evidence of trade? The difference mattered. European explorers had been moving along the Atlantic coast for decades. European goods had entered native trading networks. A metal object could travel from one community to another. A glass bead could pass between several groups. Even an English-made tool could end up hundreds of miles from the person who originally carried it. So researchers needed more than a European artifact. They needed a pattern, a group of objects, a location, a date, and ideally, evidence connecting all of those things to the Roanoke settlers. That was incredibly difficult after 400 years. Still, the archaeological record offered something that written history could not. It preserved ordinary objects. The things people used every day. The things they carried. The things they lost. The things they threw away. These small objects could survive long after their owners were forgotten. A fragment of pottery might tell us where someone lived. A piece of metal might reveal contact with another culture. A glass bead might show that two communities had traded. None of these clues could tell the entire story. But together they could reveal movement. And movement was exactly what researchers were looking for. If the Roanoke colonists had moved inland, their material possessions might have traveled with them. But there was another possibility. They might have stopped carrying those possessions altogether. Imagine a group of settlers arriving at a native settlement after months or years of hardship. Their English clothing would wear out. Their tools would break. Their food supplies would disappear. Eventually, they would have to rely on the people around them. They might adopt local clothing, use local tools, eat local food, build homes using local methods. Their European identity would gradually become less visible. After one generation, almost nothing might distinguish their descendants from the surrounding population. That would make the archaeological trail extremely difficult to follow. It would also explain why the lost colony left so little behind. The settlers may have survived precisely because they stopped living like an isolated English colony. Their survival could have erased the physical evidence of their English identity. But there was another problem. Why had no clear record of them appeared later? English settlers continued arriving in North America. Colonies expanded. Explorers traveled through the region. If descendants of the Roanoke colonists were still there, why did nobody clearly identify them? One possible answer was distance. The later English colonies were not always in close contact with the communities where the Roanoke settlers might have gone. Another possibility was language. By the time later Europeans encountered their descendants, they might no longer have spoken English. And there was an even simpler explanation. The descendants might not have known that their ancestors had once been part of Roanoke. History can disappear surprisingly quickly when it is not written down. A child may know the story of a grandparent, but after several generations, details become uncertain. Names change. Places change. Stories become shorter. And eventually, the original event can become a legend. This may have happened with Roanoke. Perhaps some native communities remembered that Europeans had once joined them. Perhaps they remembered strangers who arrived from the coast. Perhaps they remembered families who were absorbed into their communities. But the connection to the English colony could have faded. The problem for modern historians is that memory alone cannot always provide a precise date. A story about strangers arriving long ago might refer to Roanoke. Or it might refer to another European expedition. Without additional evidence, the connection remains uncertain. This is why the mystery has survived. Almost every theory has something supporting it. And almost every theory has something missing. The CROATOAN theory has the carved word. But no definitive record proves that all the colonists reached CROATOAN. The inland theory has archaeological possibilities. But no artifact has conclusively been identified as belonging to the Lost Colony. The integration theory explains how the settlers could disappear without leaving a large settlement behind. But it cannot tell us exactly where they went. And the theories involving violence or death can explain why the colonists disappeared. But they struggle to explain the absence of clear evidence of a massacre. The mystery remains balanced between these possibilities. And perhaps the most important clue was not something the colonists left behind. It was something they did not leave behind. There was no large cemetery. No mass grave. No battlefield. No obvious destruction of the settlement. That does not prove that everyone survived. But it makes a simple story of sudden destruction harder to accept. Something else may have happened. Something slower. Something involving movement. The colonists may have left before their situation became desperate. They may have divided themselves into groups. They may have followed different routes. And over time, the colony ceased to exist as a separate English settlement. That would explain why John White returned to an empty island. He was searching for a colony. But perhaps the colony had already become something else. Its people may have been scattered across a much larger world. Its buildings were abandoned. Its English identity was fading. And its history was being transferred from written records into memories, traditions, and family lines. Yet one question remained. If the colonists had moved inland, how far could they have traveled? The answer could be much farther than anyone had first imagined. Because the rivers of the region did not stop at the coastline. They extended deep into the interior. And following those waterways could lead the settlers to communities that were completely beyond the world John White knew. That possibility would push the search farther west. And with it came another clue. One that would lead historians into the heart of one of the most fascinating theories about the Lost Colony. The rivers offered a possible path into the interior. For the Roanoke colonists, this could have been one of the easiest ways to leave the coast. They did not need to carry everything on foot. They could travel by boat. They could follow waterways already used by native communities. And if they were searching for food, safety, or a new place to live, the interior offered countless possibilities. But there was something else waiting beyond the coast. A world of native communities that had existed long before the English arrived. These communities were not isolated villages scattered randomly across the wilderness. They were connected. People traded with one another. They traveled between settlements. They formed alliances. They sometimes fought wars. And information could travel through these networks much faster than a European outsider might expect. If the Roanoke colonists entered one of these networks, they could have moved surprisingly far without leaving a recognizable English settlement behind. This possibility became central to one of the most enduring theories about the Lost Colony. The colonists may have dispersed. Instead of building another English town, they may have joined existing native communities. Some could have remained together. Others may have separated. Families might have chosen different destinations. Individuals might have married into different communities. And over time, the original group could have become impossible to identify. This would also explain something that has puzzled historians for generations. Why was there no obvious second Roanoke? If more than 100 English settlers left the island, why did they not simply build another settlement somewhere else? Because they may not have had the resources to do so. The supplies they had brought from England were limited. Their food would eventually run out. Their tools would break. Their clothing would wear away. And they had no guarantee that another English ship would arrive. The easiest way to survive may have been to stop trying to remain separate. Instead of rebuilding another isolated colony, they could become part of communities that already existed. For the settlers, this might not have felt like disappearance. It might have felt like survival. A family could move into a native settlement. A farmer could learn local methods of growing food. A craftsman could exchange his skills for protection and resources. A child could grow up learning a native language. Within a few years, the English identity of the group could become much less visible. Within a few generations, it might almost disappear. This possibility is particularly important when considering Virginia Dare. She was born into the English colony, but she was still an infant when the settlement was abandoned. If she survived, almost her entire childhood would have been shaped by whatever community accepted her family. She might have grown up knowing little about England. She might have learned a different language. She might have formed relationships with people whose ancestors had lived in the region for generations. And if she eventually had children, the descendants of the lost colony could have continued living without any obvious record of their origin. This is one reason why the Roanoke mystery cannot be solved simply by searching for people who looked European. Ancestry does not always remain visible. Cultures mix. Families merge. Languages change. Names change. And memories fade. But historians needed more than a plausible story. They needed evidence. One source of evidence came from the accounts of later English explorers. Some reported hearing about native communities that had encountered Europeans. Others described people who supposedly possessed unusual knowledge of English customs or words. These accounts were intriguing, but they were also difficult to verify. The reports were often written years after the Roanoke colony disappeared. Some were based on information gathered from other people. And European observers did not always understand the cultures they were describing. A strange story could easily become exaggerated. A person with a European object could become a European. A community that traded with English settlers could later be remembered as having absorbed them. Historical memory is rarely perfectly precise. Still, the stories refused to disappear. They became part of the growing body of evidence surrounding Roanoke. And then there were the physical clues. Archaeologists continued finding European objects at native sites. Some were close to the coast. Others were farther inland. Each discovery suggested that Europeans and native communities were connected through trade and movement. But the crucial question remained unanswered. Which of these objects came from the lost colony? Without a distinctive object that could be traced directly to the 1587 settlers, certainty remained impossible. Then researchers began considering another possibility. Perhaps the colonists had not traveled as one large group at all. Maybe they had divided before leaving. Imagine more than 100 people trying to survive under increasing pressure. Some might believe CROATOAN offered safety. Others might prefer moving inland. Some families might refuse to leave. Others might already have established relationships with native communities. There could have been arguments, different plans, different destinations. The result would be a colony breaking apart. And once the groups separated, finding them would become extraordinarily difficult. John White would return to Roanoke expecting to find a community. Instead, he found an empty settlement. But an empty settlement does not tell us whether the people died together or simply left separately. That distinction may be the key to the entire mystery. The colonists may have disappeared as a colony without disappearing as individuals. And if that is what happened, then the phrase "lost colony" can be misleading. There may never have been one final place where the colonists vanished. There may have been dozens. A family here. A group there. A few survivors somewhere farther inland. Some may have died. Some may have survived. Some may have been absorbed into other communities. And some may have left descendants whose connection to Roanoke was eventually forgotten. But if the colonists truly traveled inland, one question becomes unavoidable. How far did they go? Could they have reached communities hundreds of miles from Roanoke? Could their descendants have lived there for generations? And could some of the strange stories recorded by later Europeans actually preserve memories of the missing settlers? The answer remains uncertain. But one location would eventually become especially important to the search. It was far enough inland to challenge the traditional image of the lost colony. And there, researchers found evidence that seemed to suggest that Europeans had been present long after the Roanoke settlement disappeared. The discovery would not solve the mystery, but it would move the search into an entirely new direction, away from the famous word carved into a tree, and toward the possibility that the lost colony had traveled much farther than anyone expected. The search for the lost colony had begun on a small island along the Atlantic coast. But now, more than 3 centuries later, investigators were following the possibility that the settlers had traveled far beyond it. The idea seemed strange at first. Why would more than 100 people abandon the coastline and move deep into unfamiliar territory? The answer may have been survival. Roanoke was never an easy place to maintain a permanent settlement. The colonists depended heavily on the environment around them. If crops failed, they needed another source of food. If relations with neighboring communities deteriorated, they needed somewhere safer. And if the English ships failed to return, they could not simply wait forever. Moving inland may have been a practical decision. The rivers provided routes. Native settlements provided access to food and local knowledge. And the farther the settlers moved from the coast, the less dependent they became on England. But the journey would have changed them. They were no longer simply English colonists waiting for supplies. They were people trying to survive in a world where their original plans had failed. Every mile they traveled could take them farther away from the life they had imagined. Eventually, they may have reached communities that had little reason to think of them as a separate colony. They may have been accepted as individuals. A craftsman, a farmer, a family, a child, a husband or wife. And this distinction is crucial. The disappearance of a colony does not necessarily mean the disappearance of its people. A settlement can vanish while its population continues elsewhere. That may have been what happened at Roanoke. Researchers began looking for evidence of European presence at native archaeological sites farther inland. Some discoveries were intriguing. European-made objects appeared in places where English settlers could theoretically have traveled. But once again, the evidence was difficult to interpret. Trade was widespread. European goods were valuable. A native community could acquire an English object without ever meeting an English colonist. So the presence of European material was not enough. Researchers needed to establish a direct connection between the artifacts and the missing settlers. That required dates, context, patterns, and the elimination of alternative explanations. This was slow work. There was no dramatic discovery that suddenly solved everything. Instead, the picture developed through hundreds of small pieces. An old map, a native settlement, a European artifact, a historical account, a river route, a family tradition. Each piece offered a possibility. None provided certainty. And then researchers encountered something particularly interesting. The location of certain European objects suggested that contact between native communities and Europeans had occurred farther inland than many people had previously imagined. This did not prove that the Roanoke settlers had traveled there, but it showed that such movement was possible. The interior was not beyond reach. The colonists could have traveled there. They could have followed established trade routes. They could have moved with native guides. They could have been carried by river. And once they arrived, they might have disappeared into the local population. This possibility also changes how we should understand the word lost. The colonists were lost to the English. They were lost to John White. They were lost to the records of England. But they may not have been lost to the people living around them. If they joined another community, someone would have known where they were. Someone would have seen them arrive. Someone might have married them. Someone might have raised their children. Someone might have remembered them. The problem is that those memories may not have survived in a form modern historians can easily identify. Generations passed. The English colonies expanded. Native communities experienced enormous disruption. Wars, disease, migration, and colonial expansion transformed the region. The world in which the Roanoke settlers had lived slowly disappeared. And with it, many of the connections that could have explained their fate. Yet one clue continued to appear in the historical record. Stories of people with European ancestry living among native communities. Some reports came from later English observers. Others were based on local traditions. The descriptions varied. Some seemed credible. Others were clearly exaggerated. But the repeated appearance of such stories made researchers wonder whether they preserved a memory of something real. Could the descendants of Roanoke still have been living in the region? Could Virginia Dare have survived long enough to have children? Could her descendants have become part of a native community? There was no simple way to answer these questions. A family story passed down for centuries could contain a genuine memory. But it could also change dramatically over time. Names could disappear. Events could merge. Dates could shift. And stories could absorb later events. Historical evidence therefore had to be treated carefully. The search continued. And eventually, researchers began looking for a different kind of evidence. Not a stone. Not a story. Not a rumor. Something biological. Something that might survive even when written records and buildings were gone. Something that could potentially connect living people to the distant past. The idea sounded almost impossible. But advances in science were beginning to make it possible. If descendants of the Roanoke colonists still existed, perhaps their ancestry could be traced. Perhaps the mystery that had survived for centuries could finally be examined through genetics. But before that could happen, researchers needed something even more basic. They needed a family line. They needed people who could credibly say, "My ancestors may have come from the Lost Colony." And finding such a connection would prove to be far more difficult than anyone expected. Because the Lost Colony had disappeared more than 400 years ago. And 400 years is a very long time for a family story to survive intact. The idea of finding descendants of the Lost Colony sounded almost impossible. More than 4 centuries had passed since the settlers disappeared from Roanoke. During that time, families had moved. Communities had changed. Names had been forgotten. And entire generations had come and gone. Yet if even a few of the colonists had survived and had children, their descendants might still exist somewhere in the region. The question was how to find them. A family tradition could provide a starting point. Someone might have heard an old story about an ancestor who came from the coast. Another family might have preserved a tradition of European ancestry. But stories alone could not establish a connection to Roanoke. Researchers needed a continuous chain of evidence. They needed to know who the ancestor was, who that person's children were, and how each generation connected to the next. The problem was that records from the late 16th century were extremely limited. The colonists had left England. Their lives in the New World were barely documented. And after they disappeared, there was no reliable record of their marriages, children, or deaths. Virginia Dare presented an especially difficult case. Her birth was recorded. Her parents were known, but everything after that was uncertain. If she survived, there was no confirmed record of her later life. No marriage certificate. No documented children. No confirmed burial place. No established family tree connecting her to people living centuries later. Without that chain, genetic testing could not provide a simple answer. Scientists could compare DNA between living people, but they needed a reliable reference. They needed DNA from a known descendant of the Roanoke settlers. And that was precisely what they did not have. Still, the possibility was too fascinating to ignore. Researchers began examining historical family traditions and genealogical records. They looked for families whose ancestry might connect to native communities in the region. They examined old names. They compared records from different generations. They searched for unusual claims of English ancestry. Some possibilities looked promising at first. But when examined closely, many turned out to have no reliable connection to the Lost Colony. This revealed another important problem. The idea of being descended from the Lost Colony had become part of American folklore. Over time, families could inherit stories that were impossible to verify. A family might genuinely believe that one of its ancestors was connected to Roanoke. That did not mean the story was false, but it also did not make it proven. The only way to move beyond speculation was to find independent evidence. And that evidence might come from archaeology. If a native settlement contained objects clearly dating to the Roanoke period, and if those objects were associated with a population that later developed into a known community, researchers might be able to connect the two histories. But again, the evidence remained incomplete. The colonists had arrived with European possessions. If they joined another community, those possessions might have been exchanged or lost. Their descendants might have inherited some of them. But an object passed down through generations could eventually lose its original meaning. A metal object could become an ordinary household item. A European bead could become part of local decoration. A tool could be repaired repeatedly until almost nothing of its original form remained. By the time archaeologists discovered it, the connection to Roanoke might be invisible. And yet some objects remained remarkably distinctive. 16th century European materials could sometimes be identified by their manufacturing techniques. Their age could be estimated. Their origins could be traced. When several such objects appeared together in the right archaeological context, they became much more significant. Researchers began to ask whether some of these concentrations represented the movement of English colonists. But even then, there was no final answer. The objects proved European contact. They did not necessarily prove the presence of the Lost Colony. This distinction became one of the most important lessons in the entire investigation. Evidence can suggest. Evidence can support. But evidence must be strong enough to exclude other explanations before it can become proof. And Roanoke had an enormous number of possible explanations. Trade, migration, conflict, disease, integration, starvation, movement along rivers, or some combination of all of them. The mystery was not becoming smaller. It was becoming more complicated. Then researchers began considering something else. What if the colonists had not simply joined one native community? What if they had been absorbed into several? This would explain why no single location contained enough evidence to account for the entire population. One group could have moved toward CROATOAN. Another might have traveled inland. A third could have remained somewhere near the coast. Some might have died. Some might have survived. And some might have left descendants. In that case, the Lost Colony would have left a scattered legacy rather than one identifiable settlement. The descendants, if they existed, would not necessarily know that their ancestors had come from Roanoke. They might identify themselves entirely through the history of the communities into which their ancestors had merged. Their connection to England could have become nothing more than a distant biological trace. And this is where genetics becomes both fascinating and limited. DNA can reveal ancestry. It can reveal relationships. But it cannot by itself tell us that someone is descended from a particular historical person unless there is a reliable reference for comparison. Without DNA from Virginia Dare, Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, or another confirmed member of the colony, there is no simple genetic test that can announce, this person is a descendant of Roanoke. That evidence does not exist. So the mystery remains. But the search for descendants did something important. It changed the question. Researchers were no longer asking only where the colonists went. They were asking what happened to their families. What happened to their identities? What happened to their children? And whether a small part of Roanoke might still exist in the people living in the region today. The answers would not come easily. Because sometimes history leaves behind buildings. Sometimes it leaves documents. And sometimes it leaves only people. But before scientists could search living populations for traces of the lost colony, they needed to understand exactly where the colonists might have gone. And that meant returning to the old clues. The rivers, the native settlements, the European artifacts, and above all, the mysterious word that had started the entire search. CROATOAN. Perhaps the answer had been sitting there from the beginning. Or perhaps that single word had sent generations of investigators down the wrong path. For more than 4 centuries, one word has remained at the center of the Roanoke mystery. CROATOAN. It was carved into a tree. It was the only clear message the colonists left behind. And it seemed to point toward a specific place. But perhaps the most important question is not what the word meant. It is what the colonists expected John White to do after reading it. When White left Roanoke in 1587, he gave the settlers instructions. If they were forced to leave the settlement, they were supposed to carve the name of their destination into a tree or another visible object. If they were in danger, they were supposed to add a cross. When White returned in 1590, he found the word CROATOAN. But there was no cross. That detail has fascinated historians for generations. If the colonists had been attacked and forced to flee, why was there no sign of danger? Perhaps because they had left voluntarily. Perhaps they had moved according to plan. Perhaps they believed that White would understand exactly where they had gone. If so, the mystery becomes less about a sudden disappearance and more about a failed reunion. The settlers may have expected White to return. They may have believed that he would arrive with ships and supplies. They may have planned to relocate to CROATOAN and wait there. But White did not return. The political crisis in England delayed him. The war with Spain consumed ships and sailors. Years passed. By the time he finally reached Roanoke, the colonists had already been gone for a long time. If they had moved to CROATOAN, they might not have remained there. They could have relocated again. They could have followed native communities farther inland. They could have separated. This is one reason why the word CROATOAN cannot be treated as a complete solution. It may identify where the colonists intended to go. But it does not tell us what happened after they arrived. Perhaps the colonists reached CROATOAN and were welcomed. Perhaps they lived there for a period of time. Perhaps some died. Perhaps others moved farther inland. The word could represent only the first step in a much longer journey. There is another possibility. The message may have been intended for White alone. The settlers knew that he had left. They knew he planned to return. They may have wanted to give him a simple instruction. Find us here. That would explain why there was no long explanation. The colonists did not need to write a letter. They only needed to leave a location. But there is something else that makes the clue interesting. White did not find the settlement destroyed. He did not find obvious evidence of a massacre. He did not find the bodies of more than 100 people. The buildings had been dismantled. The settlement had been abandoned. And that suggests preparation. The colonists may have packed what they could carry. They may have taken their tools, their weapons, their food, their clothing. They may have removed useful materials from the buildings before leaving. If they had been attacked suddenly, this would have been much harder. The evidence therefore fits a planned relocation better than a sudden disappearance. But planned does not mean peaceful. A group can leave voluntarily and still encounter disaster later. They might face disease, starvation, conflict, accidents, or environmental dangers. A decision that seemed sensible in 1587 could have ended tragically months later. This is why the word CROATOAN remains both powerful and frustrating. It gives us a direction, but it does not give us an ending. And the CROATOAN people themselves have become an important part of the story. They were not mysterious strangers waiting somewhere in the wilderness. They were a real native community with their own history. They had their own political relationships. They had their own culture. They were living in the region before the English arrived. If the Roanoke settlers joined them, the colonists would have entered an established society. They would not have been creating a new English colony. They would have been adapting to an existing world. That could explain why later evidence becomes so difficult to recognize. If English settlers became part of CROATOAN society, their descendants would not necessarily continue living in English houses. They might use local tools, local clothing, local food, local language. The English identity of the original settlers could gradually disappear. Their descendants might know nothing about Roanoke. Or they might remember only a distant story about ancestors who arrived from somewhere across the sea. This possibility is supported by the fact that European objects have been discovered at sites associated with native communities in the region. But again, archaeology cannot automatically identify those objects as belonging to the Lost Colony. European goods circulated through trade. The objects could have come from other English, French, or Spanish contacts. So the evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive. Still, the CROATOAN theory remains one of the strongest explanations because it begins with something the colonists themselves left behind. Not a rumor. Not a later legend. A message. A message written at the moment when the colony was disappearing. And perhaps that is why the mystery has remained so powerful. The settlers may have tried to tell the world where they were going. But the person who was supposed to receive the message arrived too late. John White found the clue. He understood it. He wanted to follow it. But the sea prevented him. And once again, the Atlantic stood between him and his family. The ships turned away. The search ended. And the colonists remained somewhere beyond the horizon. For centuries, people have asked whether CROATOAN was the answer. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the settlers reached CROATOAN and survived. Perhaps their descendants lived among the native communities of the region. Or perhaps CROATOAN was only the beginning of a journey that carried them much farther away. Because if the colonists really did move inland, the next question becomes even more intriguing. How far could they have traveled? And what evidence could they have left behind? The search for that evidence would eventually lead investigators away from the famous tree and into the forests, rivers, and settlements of the American interior. There, another chapter of the mystery was waiting. The search for the lost colony had spent centuries following stories, maps, and rumors. But eventually, investigators began looking for something that could not easily change with time. Evidence buried beneath the ground. Archaeology offered a different way to investigate Roanoke. Instead of asking what people remembered, researchers could examine what people had actually left behind. A broken piece of pottery could survive for centuries. A metal object could remain buried long after the person who owned it was forgot. A small fragment of glass could preserve a connection to a world that had disappeared. The challenge was knowing which objects belonged to the Roanoke colonists. The region had seen European activity before and after the colony existed. So every discovery had to be examined carefully. Where was it found? How old was it? What was it made from? And most importantly, could it be connected specifically to the settlers who arrived in 1587? These questions became increasingly important as archaeologists explored locations beyond the original settlement. Roanoke Island itself had already revealed evidence of the English presence. But the real mystery concerned what happened after the colonists left. If they had moved, researchers needed to find traces of them somewhere else. One promising area was Hatteras Island, the region historically associated with the CROATOAN people. Archaeological investigations there uncovered evidence of substantial interaction between native communities and Europeans. European objects were present. The discoveries demonstrated that European goods had reached the area. But that still did not prove that the lost colonists had lived there. The objects could have arrived through trade. A European item could pass from one person to another, then from one community to another. By the time it was buried, its original owner might have been completely forgot. This is why archaeology rarely provides instant answers. A single artifact can raise a question. A collection of artifacts can strengthen a theory. But only when multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction can historians begin to speak with confidence. Researchers therefore continued searching, and the search gradually expanded inland. The idea was simple. If the colonists had moved away from Roanoke, they might have followed established native routes. Those routes often followed rivers. Rivers provided water. They provided fish. They connected communities. And they offered one of the easiest ways to travel through a landscape covered by dense forests. A group carrying supplies could move much more efficiently by boat than on foot. The colonists were also familiar with boats. They had arrived by sea. They had already traveled through the coastal waterways. So moving by water would not have been unfamiliar to them. If they followed these routes, they could have reached communities far beyond the coastline. And this possibility changed the scale of the search. Researchers were no longer looking at one island. They were considering an enormous region. Every river became a possible route. Every native settlement became a possible destination. Every archaeological site became a potential piece of the puzzle. But the further they searched, the more difficult it became to distinguish Roanoke evidence from ordinary European trade. A European artifact might be found hundreds of miles from the coast. That was interesting, but it was not enough. The object had to belong to the correct period. And ideally, it needed to appear alongside evidence that suggested direct European settlement rather than simple trade. This was the standard researchers had to maintain. Otherwise, almost any European object in the region could be incorrectly labeled as evidence of the lost colony. That had happened before. The desire to solve the mystery had sometimes encouraged people to see connections that the evidence could not support. The Dare Stone was the most dramatic example. It had promised a direct message from a leaner dare. But when examined carefully, it failed to withstand scrutiny. Archaeology offered a way to avoid that mistake. The soil could be tested. Objects could be dated. Locations could be mapped. The evidence could be examined by different researchers. And gradually, a more cautious picture began to emerge. There was strong evidence that Europeans and native communities interacted throughout the region. There was evidence that European objects reached native settlements. There was evidence that the English had explored and occupied parts of the coast. But there was still no single archaeological discovery that could definitively say, "These are the remains of the lost colony." That absence was frustrating. But it was also important. It meant that the mystery remained genuinely unresolved. Researchers could not simply choose the most exciting theory and declare it true. They had to live with uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the defining features of Roanoke. Still, archaeology was beginning to reveal something else. The native communities of the region were not passive observers of the English experiment. They were active participants in a changing world. They traded with Europeans. They sometimes resisted them. They sometimes cooperated with them. They moved. They adapted. And their communities survived through enormous changes. If the Roanoke settlers entered those communities, their story would have become part of a much larger history. The colonists would no longer be isolated English settlers. They would become participants in native European relations. Their descendants could have carried pieces of both worlds. And that possibility brings us back to Virginia Dare. She was born at the beginning of an English colony. If she survived, she may have grown up somewhere completely different. She may have known a different language. She may have lived in a native community. She may have had children of her own. And if her descendants survived for generations, their connection to the lost colony could have become almost impossible to identify. But perhaps some trace remained. A family tradition, a name, an unusual story, or even a genetic connection. Modern researchers would eventually consider all of these possibilities. Yet one problem remained. Without a confirmed descendant of Virginia Dare or another Roanoke colonist, genetics could not provide a definitive answer. The evidence had to come from somewhere else first. And that meant returning to the historical record. There were accounts written by people who visited the region after Roanoke disappeared. Some mentioned native communities with stories of Europeans. Some described people who seemed to have European ancestry. Some accounts were intriguing enough to inspire new theories. But none could completely solve the mystery. The lost colony remained just beyond reach. Every time researchers seemed to approach the answer, another uncertainty appeared. Perhaps that is why the mystery has survived for so long. The evidence does not disappear completely. It simply refuses to become certain. A word on a tree. An artifact in the soil. A story passed through generations. A possible family connection. Each one points towards something. But none tells the whole story. And then came a discovery that seemed to offer another piece of the puzzle. It was not found on Roanoke. It was not found on CROATOAN. It was farther inland. And if its connection to the lost colony could be established, it would suggest that the settlers had traveled much deeper into the interior than anyone had previously imagined. The mystery was about to move farther from the coast, and closer to a place where the English settlers may have disappeared into another world. For centuries, historians had searched the coastline for the lost colony. But the clues were beginning to point somewhere else. Not toward another island. Not toward another abandoned English fort. But toward the interior of North Carolina. The idea was based on something John White himself had written. Before leaving Roanoke, White had instructed the colonists that if they were forced to move, they should travel about 50 miles inland toward the mainland. This detail had been overshadowed by the word CROATOAN. But it offered another possible explanation. Perhaps the colonists had never intended to remain on Roanoke. Perhaps they had planned to move inland if White did not return. And in 2012, researchers found something that made this possibility much more interesting. While studying one of John White's surviving maps of the region, archaeologists noticed an unusual patch covering part of the map. Beneath that patch appeared to be the symbol of a settlement. It was located inland, roughly within the area White had described. The discovery became known as the location of Site X. Researchers from the First Colony Foundation began investigating the area. They could not simply assume that the hidden symbol represented the lost colony. It could have marked another location entirely. But the possibility was intriguing enough to justify excavation. The archaeological work began revealing objects. Metal fragments. Small pieces of European material. Objects that appeared to date to the late 16th century. Some were potentially associated with Elizabethan England. Among the discoveries were items such as an aglet, a small brass object used with clothing, and other pieces of metal that could fit the period of the Roanoke settlement. The findings were intriguing, but they were not proof. European objects could have arrived through trade. Other English expeditions had visited the region, and artifacts could move from one place to another. Still, the location itself was unusual. It was close to the area White had described, and the concentration of Elizabethan-era material made the site worth investigating further. Then came another possibility. What if Site X represented only part of the story? What if the colonists had established more than one temporary settlement? A large group of more than 100 people could have divided into smaller communities. Some might have remained near the coast. Others might have moved inland. And some may have continued farther west. The archaeological evidence could therefore represent only one stage of their journey. This is where the mystery becomes especially difficult. Researchers have found evidence that European and native communities interacted throughout the region. But there is still no archaeological site that has been definitively identified as the permanent home of the Lost Colony. There are no confirmed graves, no surviving English village, no structure that can unquestionably be identified as the settlement of the 1587 colonists, and no artifact bearing the name of a known colonist. The evidence is suggestive, but the final connection remains missing. Still, Site X changed the conversation. For a long time, the word CROATOAN dominated every discussion. Now there was another possibility. The colonists may have gone inland. Perhaps they followed the instructions White had given them. Perhaps they moved toward the Albemarle Sound. Perhaps they joined native communities along the way. And perhaps some of them eventually traveled back toward the coast. The story did not have to follow one straight line. The settlers could have moved more than once. This is important because the Lost Colony may not have disappeared at a single moment. It may have dissolved gradually. First, the English settlers left Roanoke. Then they divided. Then they adapted. Then they merged with other communities. And eventually, the English identity of the group disappeared. The colony vanished from history because there was no longer a colony to record. There were only individuals living elsewhere. Families, children, descendants, and perhaps memories. This possibility also explains why later European observers sometimes heard stories of people with unusual ancestry among native communities. Those stories were never enough to prove the fate of Roanoke. But they fit a broader possibility. The settlers may have survived by becoming part of the world around them. And if they did, the most important evidence might not be a building at all. It might be the material culture they left behind. A European buckle. A fragment of metal. A piece of glass. Something ordinary that had once belonged to someone who crossed the Atlantic in 1587. Then, in recent archaeological work on Hatteras Island, researchers uncovered another type of evidence that attracted attention. Tiny fragments of iron produced during blacksmithing. These fragments are known as hammerscale. They are created when hot iron is hammered during the forging process. On their own, they are not proof of the Lost Colony. But their presence at a native settlement associated with the CROATOAN people is significant because blacksmithing is a specialized activity. It suggests that someone was working iron there. And the discovery fits with other late 16th century European artifacts found on Hatteras Island. Suddenly, the old word carved at Roanoke seemed worth looking at again. CROATOAN. Perhaps it had not been a random clue. Perhaps White's daughter and the other settlers really had gone there. Perhaps they lived alongside the CROATOAN people. Perhaps some of the English tools and objects found on Hatteras were carried there by the colonists themselves. The evidence was becoming stronger. But historians still had to be careful. The National Park Service notes that artifacts from the period have been found on Hatteras Island, but no human remains, graves, buildings, or village sites have been definitively linked to the Lost Colony. So the mystery was not completely solved. But for the first time, the possibility of survival through integration seemed more tangible than ever. The colonists may not have disappeared. They may have simply stopped being a colony. And if that was true, then the story of Roanoke was not really a story about death. It was a story about transformation. English settlers entered a native world. They needed help. They adapted. They may have formed families. Their children grew up between cultures. And eventually, the people who had once sailed from England could become almost invisible in the historical record. But there was still one final question. If the colonists survived and became part of another community, what happened to their descendants? Could any trace of those families still exist today? And could modern science finally reveal what 4 centuries of historians had failed to discover? If the lost colonists survived, then their story did not necessarily end in 1590. It may have continued through their children, and then through their children's children. For more than 400 years, those descendants could have lived without knowing that their ancestors were once part of one of the greatest mysteries in American history. The possibility sounds extraordinary, but historically it is not impossible. A small group of English settlers could have joined native communities. Their children could have grown up speaking local languages. Their grandchildren could have inherited local traditions. And after several generations, the original English connection could have become almost invisible. Names could change. Family stories could disappear. Records could be lost. But biology would remain. Every generation carries part of the genetic material of its ancestors. That led some researchers to consider whether modern DNA testing could help investigate the mystery. The idea was simple. Find families who believed they descended from the Roanoke colonists. Study their ancestry. Compare it with available genetic evidence. Look for patterns that might support or challenge the historical tradition. But there was one enormous obstacle. There was no confirmed DNA sample from a Roanoke colonist. No authenticated remains of Virginia Dare. No confirmed burial of Eleanor Dare. No known body belonging to one of the settlers. Without a reference sample, scientists could not simply compare someone's DNA to Virginia Dare and announce a match. The science could provide clues. It could not create evidence that history had failed to preserve. Researchers therefore had to rely on genealogy. They searched for family traditions. They examined historical records. They looked for people whose ancestry could potentially connect to native communities in the region. Some families had stories of European ancestors arriving generations ago. Some claimed that their ancestors were connected to the Lost Colony. But these claims were difficult to verify. A family tradition can survive for centuries. But it can also change. A story repeated by one generation may become slightly different in the next. Eventually, a historical event can become a family legend. That does not make the story meaningless. But it means historians must separate memory from evidence. And so far, no descendant has been definitively proven to descend from a specific member of the 1587 Roanoke Colony. That is an important distinction. There may be descendants. There may even be many. But there is no confirmed genealogical chain that connects a living person directly to Virginia Dare or another identified colonist. The absence of proof, however, does not prove that the descendants do not exist. It only means that the evidence has not yet been found. And this possibility keeps the mystery alive. Imagine what it would mean if one day such a connection were proven. A family living in the American Southeast could discover that their ancestry reaches back to the first English child born in the New World. Virginia Dare would no longer be only a name in an old historical record. Her story would continue through living generations. But there is another side to this possibility. If the colonists were absorbed into native communities, then their descendants would not simply represent English history. They would represent a mixture of histories: European, native, colonial, and American. The story would not belong to one culture alone. It would become a story about what happened when two worlds met. And that meeting was not always peaceful. The arrival of Europeans brought trade and new technologies. But it also brought disease, conflict, displacement, and enormous political changes. The Lost Colony existed within that larger transformation. The colonists were not simply lost individuals. They were part of the first stages of a much larger colonial history. This is why the fate of Roanoke matters. The mystery is fascinating because of the unanswered questions. But it is also historically important because it shows how difficult it can be to reconstruct the past when different cultures leave different kinds of records. The English left written documents. Native communities preserved histories through oral traditions, material culture, and community memory. Archaeologists work with objects. Historians work with documents. Geneticists work with biological evidence. Each method reveals something. None reveals everything. And sometimes the evidence from one field contradicts the assumptions of another. That is exactly what has happened at Roanoke. The written record says the colonists left a message. Archaeology suggests extensive European-native interaction. Historical accounts describe possible survivors. But no single piece of evidence connects all these clues into one unquestionable story. So researchers are left with probabilities. The strongest possibilities suggest that at least some colonists may have survived beyond Roanoke. They may have moved toward CROATOAN. They may have traveled inland. They may have joined native communities. Some may have died. Others may have left descendants. The colony itself, however, clearly disappeared. That much is certain. What remains uncertain is what happened to the people after the settlement ceased to exist. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. When we imagine a lost colony, we often picture an abandoned village. Empty houses. Silent streets. A settlement swallowed by the wilderness. But what if the reality was different? What if the houses became empty because the people had already moved on? What if the children continued growing somewhere else? What if the adults who had once dreamed of building an English colony eventually stopped thinking of themselves as English colonists at all? Then Roanoke was not a graveyard. It was a beginning. A place where one identity slowly disappeared into another. And perhaps this explains why there was never a final message. There was no one left who could write it. The people had become part of new communities. Their children belonged to a new generation. Their memories changed. Their old settlement became an abandoned place. And eventually, England forgot them. But the mystery did not disappear. It survived in the word CROATOAN. It survived in archaeological discoveries. It survived in family stories. It survived in maps and old documents. And it survived in the question that has been asked for more than 400 years. What happened to the lost colony? We may never know exactly. But there is one final piece of the story. The question is no longer only where the colonists went. It is whether the evidence we already have can tell us what kind of ending they experienced. Was Roanoke a tragedy? A migration? An act of survival? Or something more complicated? To understand that, we must return one last time to the island where the story began. Because sometimes the greatest clue is not found in the place where people disappeared. It is found in what they deliberately chose to leave behind. By the time John White returned to Roanoke in 1590, the colony he had helped establish was gone. There were no settlers waiting on the shore. No familiar voices. No children running through the settlement. No one to explain where they had gone. Only abandoned buildings. Overgrown paths. And a single word carved into the landscape. CROATOAN. More than 400 years later, that moment still defines the mystery. But after following the evidence, one thing becomes clear. The disappearance probably was not a single event. It was likely a process. The settlers were facing an uncertain future. Their supplies were limited. Their relationship with nearby communities was complicated. And the English ships they depended on were not returning. At some point, remaining on Roanoke was no longer practical. So they left. That may have been the most important decision in the entire story. They did not necessarily leave because someone attacked them. They may have left because they understood that survival required a change. Perhaps a move toward CROATOAN. Perhaps others traveled inland. Perhaps the colony divided into smaller groups. And once those groups separated, the English settlement effectively ceased to exist. This explanation fits several important pieces of evidence. The absence of a mass grave makes a single catastrophic massacre less likely. The lack of obvious destruction suggests that the settlement may have been abandoned rather than suddenly destroyed. The carved word CROATOAN suggests that at least some settlers may have intended to travel there. And archaeological discoveries demonstrate that European objects reached native communities throughout the region. None of these clues proves the entire story. But together, they make one possibility particularly compelling. Some of the colonists may have survived by becoming part of the communities around them. If that happened, the English colony disappeared while its people continued living. Their English identity may have slowly faded. Their children could have grown up in native communities. Their grandchildren may have known almost nothing about England. And eventually, the connection to Roanoke could have become impossible to distinguish from the many other histories of the region. But not everyone necessarily survived. Disease could have taken lives. Food shortages could have killed people. Conflict was possible. Travel itself could have been dangerous. Some settlers may have disappeared permanently. Others may have survived. This means the most realistic explanation may not be one dramatic theory. It may be a combination of several. Some died. Some migrated. Some were absorbed into native communities. Some may have left descendants. The colony disappeared. But the people did not necessarily disappear together. That distinction changes the way we understand the mystery. For centuries, the question has been, where did the lost colony go? But perhaps the better question is, what happened to each group of people after the colony broke apart? We may never be able to answer that for every individual. We may never know where Virginia Dare died. We may never know whether Eleanor Dare survived. We may never know whether John White's grandchildren were born somewhere deep in the Carolina interior. And perhaps there is no final document waiting to be discovered. History sometimes leaves no perfect ending. But Roanoke still leaves us with something remarkable. A reminder that disappearance does not always mean death. Sometimes people disappear from records because they move. They adapt. They marry into other communities. They change languages. They change names. They become part of another society. And eventually, history remembers the place they left behind, but forgets the people who continued living elsewhere. That may be what happened at Roanoke. The settlement disappeared, but its people may have carried parts of it with them. Their tools, their memories, their stories, their ancestry. Perhaps somewhere in the generations that followed, a family carried an old story about strangers who came from across the ocean. Perhaps someone remembered an ancestor who spoke words no one else understood. Perhaps a small European object was passed down without anyone knowing where it came from. Perhaps all that remains today is a faint trace. Too faint to prove, but strong enough to make us wonder. And that is why the Lost Colony of Roanoke remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Not because we know absolutely nothing, but because we know just enough to realize that something happened. We know the colonists arrived. We know they struggled. We know they were left behind. We know John White returned and found them gone. And we know that they left one final word. CROATOAN. Everything beyond that becomes a journey through possibilities. Maybe the answer lies beneath the soil. Maybe it survives in an archaeological site. Maybe it exists within an old family line. Maybe it is hidden inside a native tradition that has not yet been fully understood. Or maybe the final answer has already been discovered, but historians have not yet recognized how the pieces fit together. The island itself offers no easy explanation. The trees have changed. The settlements are gone. The people who stood there in 1590 have been silent for centuries. But the question remains, what happened after they left? Perhaps they walked toward the mainland. Perhaps they sailed toward CROATOAN. Perhaps they followed the rivers. Perhaps they entered another community and slowly became part of it. And perhaps somewhere along that journey, the last visible trace of the English colony disappeared. Not with a battle. Not with a dramatic final scene. But quietly. One person at a time. One family at a time. One generation at a time. Until the colony existed only in memory. And then even that memory began to fade. John White came looking for a settlement. He found an empty island. But perhaps he was searching for the wrong thing. Maybe the people he loved were no longer a colony at all. Maybe they had become something else. And that is the possibility that makes Roanoke so haunting. The lost colony may not have been lost in the wilderness. It may have been lost in history. More than 400 years have passed since John White returned to Roanoke and found the settlement empty. He never discovered what happened to his daughter, Eleanor Dare, or his granddaughter, Virginia Dare. The colonists left behind no final letter. No confirmed graves. No complete record of where they went. Only a single word carved into the landscape. CROATOAN. Perhaps some of them died. Perhaps others moved inland. Perhaps many were welcomed into native communities and slowly became part of a new world. We may never know the fate of every person who disappeared from Roanoke. And perhaps that is why the mystery still feels so alive. Because somewhere between history and legend, the Lost Colony continues to ask the same question. Did the colonists truly disappear, or did they simply disappear from history? If you enjoyed this journey into the mystery of Roanoke Colony, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the colonists survived and joined native communities, or do you think something far more tragic happened to them? If you enjoyed this calm historical story, like the video, subscribe to Sleep Lore, and share this story with someone who loves history and unsolved mysteries. And if you are listening late at night, you can simply close your eyes now. The mystery of Roanoke can remain unanswered. Perhaps some stories are meant to stay hidden. Good night.